Hello there, and good evening, and welcome to today's episode of Forum Focus. I'm Wyatt Sharp, and you might notice behind me, I'm actually in Paris. And just to kind of visualize and help all of you visualize this, I'm on a school field trip to Europe right now, learning the history of things like World War I and World War II, and just Canadian history in general. But of course, we have to ensure that we can deliver an episode for you. And so this week, we are, as I said, broadcasting to you from Paris, France. But the interesting kind of component of this is, of course, the news does not stop. We have seen significant developments on the Canadian political landscape, with Mark Carney being elected as the new leader of the Liberal Party, succeeding Justin Trudeau as Prime Minister. Mark Carney is, of course, 59 years old, securing, though, a decisive 86% of the votes, defeating former Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland, who I think going into the contest, a lot of people probably had a lot of strong expectations for her. But, Carney's extensive background, going from being governor of the Bank of Canada, governor of the Bank of England, it really makes him, in many ways, the first individual to lead two G7 central banks. And then, in addition to that, his tenure in some of these roles really have been, marked by a lot of navigation through various financial crises. Here in Canada, you can look to the financial crisis of 2008, which has earned him, obviously, a reputation as well for steady leadership. And joining me now to talk about the leadership race and its result is Steve Paikin, host of The Agenda on TVO, rather. Steve, very good to have you with us.
Wyatt, you are coming from the most amazing locations every time I talk to you. Good for you, man. Good for you.
Thank you so much. I mean, it's always fascinating to talk to you about any political story, but this one in particular, you were telling me just before we began recording our episode here that you were actually in Ottawa at the Liberal Leadership Convention. So I suppose let me just begin by asking you about kind of the mood that people felt when Chrystia Freeland only managed to secure 8% of the vote. If you had asked me a few months ago how Chrystia Freeland was going to perform, I would think not only me, but a lot of political observers probably would have predicted it would have been a lot better.
I wouldn't have. I'm sorry to say. I think what the Liberal Party of Canada was looking for right now was something completely divorced from what the Trudeau government has brought us over the last 9+ years. So obviously, Chrystia Freeland being the deputy prime minister of that government, being the finance minister of that government for a lot of it, despite the way that she exited the scene with a rather dramatic resignation, the fact of the matter is she's still associated with much of what the Trudeau government did. And therefore, if you're looking for a very clean break, it's a change election, Wyatt. It's a change election. So Chrystia Freeland did not represent change. Karina Gould, who was also a former cabinet minister who was running for the leadership, did not represent change. They got, I think, 8% and 3% respectively of the votes, or of the points, I should say, because they use that point system. So no surprise to me that Carney won huge, because they are looking to put a very new, fresh coat of paint on this party in anticipation of the next election.
And I guess the reason I mentioned that kind of there in the introduction was because people like Pierre Poilievre even didn't win by such a large margin. And over the course of his leadership campaign, I think it was pretty safe to say that he was going to win that leadership contest as well. So I guess the question of party unity can kind of be put to bed for Mark Carney. And, usually that's the question that we ask after these sorts of leadership contests, which obviously he's not going to have to face those questions. But what are some of his biggest challenges, even if that is not one of them?
Well, I agree with you, first of all, that party unity it does not appear to be an issue for the Liberals right now. When you get 86% of the points at a leadership convention, there is obviously great consensus around your victory. And I went through riding by riding last night after coming home from Ottawa. I checked every single riding in the country. Carney won every single one. Like, not even Poilievre, who had a very strong victory, won every single riding. But Carney won every single riding. So that gives you an indication of his stranglehold on the Liberal Party right now. What are his big challenges? Well, obviously, challenge number one, he's got to find a date to get sworn in as prime minister. He's got to swear in a new cabinet. I don't know how much change he wants to make from the current cabinet that exists. I would expect, I mean, who knows, but I would expect not too much. Presumably he's going to be, his second big challenge is figuring out when to call an election. And the betting at the moment is that he's going to strike while the iron is hot. So he'll probably go soon, in which case, why bother to present a very dramatic different cabinet that, may only last a month. And then if you win, you swear in a different one. Or anyway, so he's got that to figure out. Second thing is, and it was abundantly clear in the speech he gave last night after winning, his French is not good. And he's not going to be able to improve his French dramatically enough in the next month and a half during what we presume will be an election campaign to make a difference in Quebec. So his unique selling proposition is, as you described it in the intro. I've been the central banker in two G7 countries. I understand the economy. I can handle Trump. That's what he's selling to Canadians. And it will be up to Canadians to decide whether or not they are satisfied with that. And it will be up to Quebecers to decide whether or not his French is adequate to satisfactorily represent them.
And I mean, I think a lot of what you've been hearing from the conservatives over the course of, Justin Trudeau's tenure has been painting him as the carbon tax prime minister. And they're not going to be able to do that, a lot of people are saying, at least, as effectively with Mark Carney, given he has said he's going to scrap the consumer price on carbon. So does that mean the conservatives kind of in general, does it speak to a larger issue that now they're going to have to make a pivot on some of their messaging?
Well, yes, and they're doing it already. I mean, you heard for a couple of years, Pierre Poilievre, the conservative leader, saying we need a carbon tax election. He's not really saying that anymore because, of course, we're not going to have a carbon tax election because all the parties are in essential agreement on the carbon tax issue. And yes, Carney pointed that out in his victory speech yesterday when he said, one of the first things I'm going to do is eliminate the consumer portion of the carbon tax. It will remain on big polluters, big businesses, but not on consumers.
Mhm.
No, you're starting to see it already from Pierre Poilievre. Canada first is his message. Whereas in the first year or two of his prime ministership, uh, I don't think that he was particularly offended by the comparisons to populist politics in the United States. And the fact is that there would be considerable overlap of Donald Trump's base and Pierre Poilievre's base. You don't hear that anymore. In fact, I went to a press conference last Friday that Pierre Poilievre had in Toronto, at which time he was going hard against Donald Trump. And you see that now, both with Poilievre and with Doug Ford, the Premier of Ontario, two guys whose the base of whose parties you would find certain amount of simpatico with Donald Trump, and yet they are both coming out hard against Donald Trump. So I think obviously everybody understands right now that Donald Trump is not a friend of Canada. I don't know if he's an enemy of Canada, but he's certainly an adversary of Canada right now. And any Canadian politician who wants to get elected or reelected has to run against Trump. That's just all politics is local, and that's about as local as it gets.
Welcome back to Forum Focus. I'm here once again with Steve Paikin, host of The Agenda on TVO. Steve, before the break, you were talking a little bit about this idea of Ontario and its relationship with Mark Carney. Ontario Premier Doug Ford had released a statement where he very boldly said a lot of times I think when you see these statements, it's very simple as congratulations and just celebrations in general. But he pointed out in that he's looking forward to Mark Carney getting rid of this carbon pricing that we're talking about. Is that maybe Doug Ford trying to assist Pierre Poilievre in his messaging, or is it genuinely just something that he himself feels strongly about?
It's definitely not the first one because we know that one of the reasons Doug Ford wanted an early election was in part to get out ahead of the federal campaign, and in part because he and the Poilievre team have terrible relations. Jenny Byrne is maybe more in the weeds than your viewers want to know, but Jenny Byrne is the senior campaign advisor to Pierre Poilievre. She used to work in Doug Ford's premier's office. She was fired from that job. And as a result, the relationship between the two leaders and between much of their teams is not good. So the fact of the matter is they may both be conservatives, but there is no love lost between the two of them. So anything Doug Ford does, you can be sure the motive behind it is not to help Pierre Poilievre and the federal conservatives. No, Doug Ford's been campaigning against the carbon tax for 7 years. So he certainly would have been gratified to hear that Carney intends to kill the carbon tax, at least the consumer portion of it. And you can bet that Doug Ford was reminding everybody that he's been campaigning against it, and Carney had better follow through on that, or he's going to continue to campaign against it.
Yeah, and if we're talking too about this idea of kind of Mark Carney and then him trying to find a spot for some of the people who were associated with the Trudeau brand, is that something he's going to shy away from to prevent people associating himself with Justin Trudeau?
I can't predict the future. I don't know what decisions he's going to make, but I often look back to the past to see what's happened and see whether leaders learn from that. I've got a column up on the TVO website today making the comparison between another liberal leader who won a big victory, who was an outsider 41 years ago. It was the first liberal leadership convention I ever covered. This was in 1981. John Turner, who had been in public life, left for the private sector for 10 years, was a superstar like Mr. Carney, sat on a lot of boards like Mr. Carney, had an international reputation like Mr. Carney, and won his convention in smashing fashion, came in and made mistake after mistake after mistake. People looked for John Turner to put a new coat of paint on the Liberal Party and really refresh the brand. He basically reappointed so many of Mr. Trudeau, the previous Mr. Trudeau, Pierre Trudeau's cabinet ministers, that people thought, wait a second, where's the big change that we've been waiting for? This is a lot of more of the same. So if Mark Carney is a student of history, and I know that he is, he will take pains to really show, because this is a change election, Wyatt. It's not like the last Ontario election, which was a more of the same election. This is a change election. And people are looking first and foremost to see whether the Liberal Party under Mark Carney can provide them with the kind of change they want. And if it doesn't, then they'll try somebody else.
Welcome back to Forum Focus. I'm Wyatt Sharp. I'm joined now by Anthony Koch, who is, of course, Pierre Poilievre's spokesperson, and he is also, of course, now with AK Strategies as well. Anthony, good to have you with us.
Thanks for having me.
Let's just start out. You hear a lot of talk from some of the pundits in the media and in the press about a Mark Carney liberal leadership, which we obviously now have. That is the reality, and how that will decrease the chances of a Pierre Poilievre government. Do you think people in conservative circles are starting to get worried or nervous about that?
No, and I mean, I think it's fair to say that we all assumed that Mark Carney was going to be the new liberal leader for quite some time now. I mean, and the numbers yesterday supported that this was a coronation in all but name. But in terms of people being stressed or worried, I don't think so, man. We're still here to do the same job that Mr. Poilievre was elected to do a few years ago, which is to articulate the conservative alternative for Canada to replace this liberal government.
And I mean, you heard a lot of talk from Pierre Poilievre attaching Justin Trudeau to the carbon tax, and then it seems as if he's trying to still do that with Mark Carney in some ways, but perhaps it's made a little bit more difficult by Mark Carney saying he will get rid of the consumer carbon tax. And then even with Liberals kind of as a whole, them electing Mark Carney as opposed to Chrystia Freeland, who only finished with 8% of the vote, does that kind of make it harder for him to use that messaging and perhaps, furthermore, prove that Liberals are not really kind of as interested or associated with the Trudeau brand anymore?
Yeah, well, I think it's actually quite similar to what happened in British Columbia. Okay, so similar sort of phenomenon there. You have a conservative party now led by John Rustad that was going up against an NDP government under David Eby that was and still remains a very close ally of the federal government under Justin Trudeau's Liberals. And before the campaign, or during the campaign, I should say, they made a whole big hoopla about the fact that they were going to scrap the carbon tax, the consumer-based carbon tax. They were going to reverse all these decisions. They were going to bring in tax cuts, ripped off wholesale, or at least claimed to rip off wholesale, a bunch of conservative policy ideas. And then lo and behold, once they were reelected, they instantaneously backtracked on all of those promises. Mark Carney, it's important to state here too, is not just your run-of-the-mill Trudeau liberal who supported the carbon tax the way everybody else supported the carbon tax. Him and his wife were part of the origin story of making carbon pricing and carbon taxes a thing worldwide. It's a passion project for him. And he's even said on multiple occasions that he actually fundamentally doesn't have a problem with the tax, that he thinks it's good. He just thinks that it wasn't explained properly and as such has become far too unpopular to be able to support in the context of general election campaign. So this is not somebody who is ideologically opposed to this. He just thinks that it's momentarily inopportune. And I have no doubt that the first opportunity that he's going to get, he'll bring something back under a slightly different name that fulfills functionally the same purpose.
Yeah, and I mean, it's interesting too because you see kind of oftentimes in politics kind of the words of people coming back to haunt them when they run for office. I was seeing somewhere earlier today even that in his memoir he had praised the carbon tax, specifically even the Trudeau carbon tax. And so it's interesting to kind of note that as well. But does that speak to kind of, a broader issue, something that the Conservatives can play into, going back and attaching Mark Carney to Justin Trudeau? Obviously, he advised the Liberals as well over the course of several election campaigns. What are your kind of general thoughts on that?
And this is the weird thing, I think, to some extent. I mean, beyond the fact we all know he was a senior economic advisor to the prime minister, was a big cheerleader for him, supported him, was even, rumored at various points to be offered the finance minister position in Mr. Trudeau's cabinet in the event when he, now famously removed Chrystia Freeland from the post. There was even rumors that he was going to run in Ottawa South under the Trudeau Liberal banner. So this is somebody who fundamentally was a cheerleader until the very end for Justin Trudeau's government. I mean, look at yesterday night when he actually that we had that whole festivity for the next new crowned liberal leader. He dedicated a significant portion of his speech to talking about how wonderful Justin Trudeau's government was, and then gave him a big hug and a smooch when all was said and done. So if that's what change looks like, if that's what a new liberal party is, well, I think a lot of people are going to have a few words to say about that.
And you're hearing in his speech, for one, but also just kind of now in the days and hours after them and specifically Carney's team talking about his upbringing from, a small town to really the pinnacle of international finance, if you want to, call it that. And so is that something that, Pierre Poilievre is going to have to face? And to what extent will that be challenging? You're hearing a lot from the Liberals, but Mark Carney specifically, that Pierre Poilievre has been a politician his whole life.
Yeah, I mean, if they want to make his career a centerpiece of this campaign, I don't think you're going to find any conservatives who are really going to complain. I mean, the first thing that he did, and much now like the big gotcha, I guess you could say that he's really experienced, was when he lied about the fact that I had resigned as chair before Brookfield Asset Management made the decision to move its corporate headquarters from Toronto in Canada to New York City in the United States of America, most specifically almost immediately after Donald Trump was elected president of the United States of America. So it's interesting that, there was more faith in the economy that he believes is going to be built by Donald Trump than the economy that he helped build with Justin Trudeau. And yet now he's trying to articulate this vision of how much he loves Canada. Very much similar to the idea here, where a few weeks ago he claimed that Canada's economy was weak before the tariff war, but then a week later wanted to change the cut of his jibe, so to speak, and rework it to say that Canada's economy is incredibly strong. In fact, it's even stronger than the United States. So, if he wants to talk about his career, great. I think it should start with a full financial disclosure to see what kind of conflicts the guy has. I know he doesn't want to do that, and he even made light of it yesterday in his speech, but we'll see. So, if they want to talk about his career, I think you'll find that conservatives very much want to do so as well.
All right, we'll leave it there. We'll pick it up right after the break. Stay with us. Welcome back to Forum Focus. I'm Wyatt Sharp. Before the break, we had Anthony Kosh, who of course served as a spokesperson to Pierre Poilievre, talking about kind of Mark Carney's election and how that will impact the conservative strategy, specifically Pierre Poilievre. I want to pick up on what you mentioned just before the break, and that was this kind of idea that Mark Carney might call an early election to prevent some of kind of his inner workings from being released. Do you think, though, that, an early election would benefit the conservatives more than it would the liberals, perhaps even right now? I mean, Mark Carney doesn't have a lot of time to introduce himself to the general population, with kind of the timeline that we're looking at for when this election might happen.
So I actually think it's in the liberals' interest to call an early election for a variety of reasons. One of which is that, just from a pure partisan perspective, there are no spending limits for advertising outside of the context of an election period. The conservatives have a massive monetary advantage over the liberals right now, which means that for every day that we spend outside of the context of an election period, they have millions of dollars, the conservatives do, to spend blasting this guy. The second an election is called, there is now a spending limit in place. Now, conservatives will still have a monetary advantage, but it'll be greatly reduced. Similarly, the rise of liberal fortunes is almost entirely tied to Donald Trump's decision to start a trade war with Canadians that nobody wanted on either side of the border. And I think they see that there is a unique moment and opportunity to perform better than they otherwise would have, shall we say. And I think there's some concern in liberal land that if they let this moment pass by and the sort of immediate fever of this moment subsides, that their numbers are going to start going back to where they were in the immediate preceding period before Trump decided to go in this direction, before Mr. Trudeau resigned.
And just lastly here, I mean, you mentioned Donald Trump, and to pick up on that, if we look to what Donald Trump has said about Pierre Poilievre recently, he hasn't said a whole lot about Mark Carney, but he did post on Truth Social saying that Pierre Poilievre is, I think his words were not MAGA, and so like he doesn't seem to be too thrilled with the fact that Pierre Poilievre is not kind of embracing the same rhetoric that you have from other right-wing leaders like Viktor Orban or the El Salvadorian president as well. Does Donald Trump perhaps fear Pierre Poilievre in a way that he doesn't Mark Carney yet because maybe he doesn't know Mark Carney as well? I mean, you're hearing that kind of rhetoric in the media recently.
I think Mr. Trump would love another liberal prime minister because it provides him with a natural ideological contrast agent that he can use both domestically and projecting to the world. Whereas if you've got another conservative prime minister in Canada, a conservative leader that is widely liked and respected, even among figures, across the world that are not just Canadian right wingers, who's telling you that what you're doing is wrong and that Canada has no interest in it, I think that's much more likely to make people have some pause and second looks about what exactly is going on here. Whereas if he just has Justin Trudeau 2.0 once again as his favorite punching bag and he can do this sort of right wing, left wing contrast, I think it's probably much more advantageous for him. So I don't think it's as simple as, Donald Trump likes conservative leaders abroad. I think there's more to it than just that. But at the end of the day, Canadian conservatives are not Republicans, and we love Canada. And anybody, whether it's the president of the United States or otherwise, who directly threatens our sovereignty is no friend of us.
All right, we will leave it there. Anthony Kosh, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, that's going to do it for this episode of Forum Focus. Be sure to stay engaged, stay informed. Check out more of our episodes on thenewsforum.ca. For now, though, I'm Wyatt Sharp in Paris. Thank you for joining us, and good night.